Baby moves during the funeral and leaves everyone in shock. The afternoon sky was cloaked in heavy gray clouds, casting a somber shadow over the small church perched on the hillside. A bitter wind whistled through the cracks of the ancient wooden doors, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. Inside, the air was dense with grief, an almost tangible weight that pressed down on everyone gathered. The soft flicker of candlelight illuminated the worn stone walls, creating shadows that danced eerily around the room. In the center of the church stood a tiny white coffin, adorned with a single bouquet of lilies that seemed too fragile for the moment. Around it, family and friends sat in a heavy silence, their faces etched with sorrow. The soft murmur of whispered prayers blended with the occasional muffled sob, but no sound could mask the pain that filled the space. A young mother sat closest to the coffin, her face pale and her eyes hollow from days of crying. She clutched a baby blanket to her chest, pressing it against her heart as if it were the last connection to her child. Beside her, the father stood stiffly, his trembling hands gripping the back of a wooden pew. His face was a mask of stoic grief, but the faint quiver in his lips betrayed the storm raging inside him. Time seemed to stand still in the church, the mourners lost in their private worlds of sorrow. But then, just as the priest began reciting a solemn prayer, a faint sound broke through the silence, a soft rustling, like the flutter of a bird's wing. At first, no one reacted. The sound was so faint that it could have been the wind. But then it came again, this time accompanied by the softest of movements. A single hand, impossibly small, twitched beneath the bouquet of lilies. The mother's breath caught in her throat, her gaze snapping to the coffin. She froze, her mind racing, unable to believe what she thought she had seen. "No," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "It can't be." A gasp escaped from one of the relatives seated nearby. "Did you see that?" the woman asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. The baby moved." The father's head whipped around, his eyes wide with fear and hope. For a moment, no one moved, the entire room paralyzed in shock. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, he stepped forward, his legs unsteady beneath him. The room fell into a tense, expectant silence. All eyes were fixed on the coffin, the air charged with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. And then, before anyone could say a word, it happened again. The tiny hand moved, curling ever so slightly into a fist. A scream pierced the air, raw, primal, and filled with equal parts fear and joy. It came from the mother, who lunged forward, her trembling hands reaching for the lid of the coffin. "My baby," she cried, tears streaming down her face. The father was by her side in an instant, his own hands shaking as he helped her lift the lid. What they saw inside took their breath away. The baby's chest, so still just moments before, now rose and fell with faint but unmistakable breaths. "He's alive," the father choked out, his voice breaking as he scooped the baby into his arms. Around them, the mourners erupted into chaos. Some screamed, others sobbed, and a few dropped to their knees, crossing themselves and whispering fervent prayers of thanks. Amid the confusion, a man stepped forward, a doctor who had been among the mourners. He moved quickly, his years of experience overcoming the shock of the moment. "Give him to me," he said firmly, his hands outstretched. The father hesitated, his protective instincts battling with his reason. But at a nod from the mother, he gently placed the baby into the doctor's arms. The man examined the child carefully, his fingers searching for a pulse, his ear pressed to the baby's chest. The church fell silent once more, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The doctor's brow furrowed as he worked, his expression unreadable. And then, finally, he looked up, his face a mixture of disbelief and relief. "He's alive," the doctor confirmed, his voice steady but laced with awe. This child has come back to life." The mother collapsed to her knees, her hands clasped in prayer as tears streamed down her face. "Thank you," she sobbed, her voice cracking with emotion. "Thank you, God." The father knelt beside her, pulling her into his arms as they both wept openly. Around them, the mourners began to chant prayers of gratitude, their voices rising in a chorus that echoed through the church like a hymn of hope. But even as the cries of joy filled the air, one question lingered in everyone's mind: how could this have happened? The answer, they knew, was something they might never fully understand. Yet in that moment, it didn't matter. For the first time in days, the church was filled not with grief, but with the radiant light of a miracle. The church, once shrouded in sorrow, now buzzed with chaotic energy. The sound of hurried footsteps and gasps of astonishment filled the air, mingling with the faint cries of the baby in the doctor's arms. Outside, the clouds began to shift, revealing slivers of sunlight that streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the worn stone floor. It was as if the world itself was reacting to the impossible event unfolding within those sacred walls. The mother, her legs weak from shock and relief, clung to the edge of a pew for support. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched the doctor carefully examine her child, his face a mask of concentration. Every movement of the baby's tiny hands, every soft murmur that escaped his lips, felt like a new breath of life for her. Is he okay?" she finally managed to ask, her voice trembling. The doctor looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of reassurance and caution. "His heartbeat is faint, but steady," he said. "He's alive, but we need to get him to the hospital immediately. Whatever happened here, it's nothing short of extraordinary, but he'll need care to ensure he's safe." The father nodded, his jaw tight as he tried to process everything. "I'll drive," he said, his voice firm despite the turmoil within him. He reached out to take the baby from the doctor, cradling the small body against his chest as if he were holding the most precious treasure in the world. The mother moved to his side, her hand resting gently on the baby's head. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was unclear whether she was speaking to the doctor, the heavens, or some unseen force that had intervened. As they hurried out of the church, the gathered mourners followed, their whispers filling the air like a chorus of disbelief and wonder. "A miracle," one woman said, crossing herself repeatedly. "We witnessed a miracle." Others nodded, their faces a mixture of fear and reverence. "How can this be? He was gone, we all saw it." The priest, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward, his expression solemn. "Sometimes, the divine works in ways we cannot understand," he said. His voice carried a weight that silenced the murmurs around him. "Let us pray that this child continues to be blessed with life." Outside, the air was crisp and cool, the storm clouds dissipating to reveal a pale blue sky. The father quickly secured the baby in the back seat of their car, while the mother climbed in beside him, refusing to let go of his tiny hand. The doctor followed in his own vehicle, ready to assist at the hospital if needed. As the car sped down the winding road, the mother found herself staring at her child's face, searching for any sign of discomfort or distress. Instead, she saw something that took her breath away, the faintest hint of a smile. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice breaking with emotion. "He smiled." "I swear he smiled." The father glanced at the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. "He's telling us he's here," he said softly. "He's fighting." The journey to the hospital felt both endless and fleeting, the landscape outside a blur as their focus remained solely on the baby. When they arrived, a team of nurses and doctors was already waiting, alerted by the doctor who had followed them. The baby was whisked away into an examination room, leaving the parents standing in the sterile white corridor, holding on to each other as if their lives depended on it. Minutes stretched into hours as they waited for news. The hospital's fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow, but neither the mother nor the father noticed. Their thoughts were consumed by the fragile life that had been returned to them against all odds. Finally, the doctor emerged, his face calm but serious. He approached them with measured steps, his clipboard held tightly against his chest. "The baby is stable," he said, and the words felt like music to their ears. "We're running tests to understand what happened, but for now, he's breathing on his own and responding well." The mother let out a sob of relief, collapsing into a chair as tears streamed down her face. The father knelt beside her, holding her hand tightly as he whispered words of gratitude. "But there's something else," the doctor continued, his tone cautious. "His condition defies medical explanation. From everything we can tell, he should not have survived. Yet here he is." The parents exchanged a glance, their minds racing with questions they didn't know how to ask. The mother finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Do you believe it was a miracle?" The doctor hesitated, his gaze softening. "As a man of science, I can't say for certain. But as someone who witnessed what happened today, I won't rule it out." The weight of his words hung in the air as the parents absorbed their meaning. They knew that no matter what the tests revealed, no matter how the doctors explained it, the truth of what had happened in that church would remain with them forever. As the mother and father entered the room where their baby now rested, swaddled in soft blankets, they felt a profound sense of gratitude. The baby's breathing was steady, his tiny fingers curling around his mother's thumb. The father leaned down, placing a gentle kiss on his son's forehead. "You're our miracle," he whispered. And though the room was quiet, the mother could have sworn she heard the faintest echo of laughter, soft and pure, like the sound of life itself being celebrated. The hospital room was bathed in the soft glow of a bedside lamp, casting long shadows on the walls. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the silence, a constant reminder of the fragile life that had been returned to them. The baby lay peacefully in his crib, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. His parents sat nearby, their eyes fixed on him as if afraid that looking away might make him disappear. The mother reached out, her fingers lightly brushing against her baby's cheek. His skin was warm, alive, and the simple act brought tears to her eyes. "It's like he was never gone," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. The father, seated beside her, nodded slowly. "But he said, his voice heavy. We held his hand, kissed his forehead, said goodbye, and now, here he is." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he stared at their child. "How do we make sense of this?" The mother didn't respond immediately. Instead, she leaned closer to the crib, studying every detail of her baby's face. His tiny lips were parted, his hands curled into soft fists. She thought back to the moment in the church, the sheer terror and elation that had consumed her. "Maybe we're not meant to make sense of it," she said finally. "Maybe we're just meant to be grateful." The door opened quietly, and the doctor entered, holding a clipboard. His expression was unreadable, but there was a hint of exhaustion in his eyes. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "We're fine," the father replied. "But what about him? Is he really okay?" The doctor approached the crib, carefully observing the baby before turning to the parents. "Medically, he's stable," he said. "His vitals are strong, and there's no sign of distress. We're still running tests to understand what happened, but so far, everything points to one undeniable fact: your baby is alive and well." The mother exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said, her words barely audible. But the doctor didn't leave. He hesitated, glancing down at his clipboard before speaking again. "There's something you should know," he said. "When we reviewed his initial condition, everything indicated that he had been without a heartbeat for several minutes. Under normal circumstances, this would lead to irreversible damage. But in his case..." He paused, searching for the right words. "It's as if time stood still for him. His body shows no signs of trauma, no lingering effects. It's unexplainable." The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled over them. The parents exchanged a glance, their emotions a whirlwind of relief, confusion, and something that felt dangerously close to fear. "What are you saying?" the father asked cautiously. "I'm saying," the doctor replied, "that what happened to your son goes beyond what medicine can explain. You might call it a miracle. And while I can't give you answers, I can tell you this: cherish this moment. Hold on to him, and don't let go." The mother's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to take her husband's hand. Together, They sat in silence, their minds racing with questions they couldn't yet articulate. Later that night, after the doctor had left and the hospital had settled into its usual quiet hum, the mother found herself alone with her baby. Her husband had stepped out to call their family, leaving her to watch over the child who had defied death itself. The room felt still, almost sacred, as she leaned over the crib. "You're stronger than I'll ever understand," she whispered, brushing her fingers against his tiny hand. "I don't know why you came back to us, but I promise I'll spend the rest of my life protecting you." The baby stirred slightly, his fingers curling around hers. The simple gesture sent a wave of emotion crashing over her, and she felt tears slipping down her cheeks. She pressed a kiss to his forehead, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. When the father returned, he found her sitting by the crib, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the lamp. "I spoke to our parents," he said quietly, taking a seat beside her. "They're on their way. They want to see him." The mother nodded, her gaze never leaving the baby. "They should see him," she said. "They need to understand what happened." "We all do." The father placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Whatever happens next," he said, "we'll face it together. As a family." Outside, the night was calm, the storm that had raged earlier now a distant memory. The moon hung low in the sky, its silver light spilling over the hospital grounds. Inside the room, the parents sat in quiet vigil, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. In the stillness, the baby let out a small, soft coo, as if reminding them that he was there, alive and breathing. It was a sound that carried with it a promise, a fragile but undeniable thread of hope that would guide them through whatever lay ahead. The morning sun filtered through the hospital blinds, casting golden rays across the room. The baby lay peacefully in his crib, his tiny body bathed in the gentle light. For the first time in days, his mother felt a sliver of calm wash over her. She sat by his side, her fingers lightly tracing patterns on the edge of the blanket. Every breath her son took felt like a gift, a reminder of the impossible reality they were living. The father entered the room quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one on the table beside her and sat down, his eyes immediately falling on their child. "He looks so peaceful," he murmured, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile serenity of the moment. The mother nodded, her gaze never leaving the baby. "I keep thinking I'll wake up, that this is all a dream," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of days spent in fear and hope. "But he's here. He's really here." Before the father could respond, a soft knock at the door interrupted them. The doctor stepped in, his expression unreadable as he held a folder in his hands. "Good morning," he greeted, his tone measured. "I have some updates regarding your son." The couple exchanged a glance before turning their full attention to the doctor. He approached the crib, his gaze briefly lingering on the baby before he turned to the parents. "We've completed the initial tests," he began, his voice calm but deliberate. "Physically, your son is perfectly healthy. His organs are functioning as they should, and there are no signs of distress or trauma." The mother let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her shoulders sagging with relief. "Thank God," she whispered. But the doctor's expression remained serious. "However," he continued, "there's something unusual we need to discuss." He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "We found no medical explanation for what happened to him. Based on the reports from the church and the observations made here, your son's survival defies everything we understand about the human body." The father frowned, leaning forward in his chair. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice tense. The doctor sighed, placing the folder on the table. "It means that, scientifically, we can't explain why your son is alive. His heartbeat had stopped, his body showed no signs of life, and yet here he is, thriving. Some might call it a miracle." The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled over them. The mother reached for the father's hand, squeezing it tightly. "So, what happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For now," the doctor replied, We'll keep monitoring him to ensure he remains stable. But I don't expect any complications. Your son is strong. He's a fighter." The mother nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her gratitude evident in every syllable. After the doctor left, the couple sat in silence, processing everything they had just heard. The father finally broke the quiet, his voice heavy with emotion. "What if this really is a miracle?" he asked, looking at his wife. "What if he was brought back for a reason?" The mother didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned over the crib, gently brushing her fingers against the baby's cheek. "If he was," she said softly, "then we need to protect him. We need to make sure he grows up knowing how much he's loved." As the day went on, visitors began arriving. Their parents were the first to enter the room, their faces a mixture of disbelief and relief as they laid eyes on the baby. The grandmother, her hands trembling, reached out to touch the child, her lips moving in a silent prayer. "I never thought I'd see this day," she said, her voice breaking. "This is nothing short of divine intervention." The father stood nearby, watching as his parents and in-laws surrounded the crib. Their reactions varied, some whispered prayers, others wiped away tears, but all of them shared the same awe. The baby, oblivious to the attention, let out a soft coo, his tiny hands reaching for the light streaming through the window. In the days that followed, the story of the baby who came back to life spread like wildfire. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers came to the hospital, each bringing their own questions, blessings, and theories. Some called it a miracle. Others searched for logical explanations. But for the parents, none of that mattered. All they cared about was the child who had been given back to them. Late one night, as the hospital grew quiet, the mother found herself alone with her son. She held him in her arms, rocking him gently as he slept. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting a warm light on their faces. "I don't know why you were chosen," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I promise I'll do everything I can to be worthy of this gift. You're our miracle, and I'll never let you forget that." Outside, the moon hung high in the sky, its silver light spilling over the hospital grounds. The mother gazed out the window, her heart filled with gratitude and a quiet resolve. No matter what challenges lay ahead, she knew one thing for certain: they had been given a second chance, and she would cherish it for the rest of her life. As the baby stirred in her arms, his tiny fingers curling around hers, she felt a profound sense of peace. It was a feeling that, no matter how fleeting, reminded her that miracles, no matter how inexplicable, were real. And she was holding hers. The quiet hum of the hospital at night was broken only by the soft sounds of footsteps in the hallway and the faint rustling of leaves outside the window. The baby's steady breathing was the rhythm that anchored his mother as she sat by his crib, her thoughts an endless loop of gratitude and confusion. Beside her, the father stared out of the window, the glow of the city lights reflecting in his tired eyes. "He's sleeping so peacefully," the mother whispered, almost as if speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile calm. The father turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "I keep wondering why," he said quietly. "Why us? Why him? How did this happen?" The mother didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached out to touch the baby's tiny hand, her fingers brushing against his soft skin. "Maybe we're not supposed to understand it," she said finally. "Maybe it's enough that he's here." The father sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It just doesn't make sense," he muttered. "Every doctor, every test, they all say the same thing. There's no explanation." The mother looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "Do we need one?" she asked. "Does knowing why change anything? He's alive. That's all that matters." Before the father could respond, a soft knock at the door interrupted them. The doctor entered, his face calm but serious, holding a clipboard against his chest. "Good evening," he said, his voice low. "I wanted to check on your son before I head out for the night." The couple nodded, stepping aside to give the doctor room. He leaned over the crib, carefully observing the baby as he slept. After a moment, he straightened and turned back to the parents. "He's doing remarkably well," he said. "His vitals are strong, and there's no sign of any underlying issues. If this continues, we may be able to discharge him in a few days." The mother let out a sigh of relief, her hand instinctively clutching her husband's. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The doctor hesitated, glancing down at his clipboard. "There's something else I wanted to discuss," he said, his tone more measured. "We've reviewed his case thoroughly, and while we can't explain what happened, there are patterns we've seen in similar cases." The father frowned, stepping closer. "Similar cases?" he asked. "What do you mean?" The doctor hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "There have been rare instances," he began, "where patients, particularly infants, experience what some might call spontaneous recovery. It's almost as if their bodies decide to restart after shutting down. But those cases often leave lingering effects, neurological damage, organ dysfunction. Your son, he's different." The mother's brow furrowed. "Different how?" The doctor met her gaze, his expression both puzzled and odd. "There's no evidence of trauma. No damage, no weakness. It's as if he was never gone. His body is completely unmarked by what should have been a fatal event." The weight of his words settled over them, heavy and unrelenting. The mother sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "So, what does that mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The doctor shook his head. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever the reason, your son is a medical anomaly. A miracle, some might say. And while we can't explain it, we can ensure that he receives the best care possible moving forward." After the doctor left, the couple sat in silence, the words "a miracle" and "anomaly" echoing in their minds. The father finally spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. "What if there's a reason he came back?" he asked. "What if he's meant for something we can't understand yet?" The mother looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Then we make sure he has everything he needs to find out," she said. In the days that followed, the baby continued to thrive, his strength and vitality defying every expectation. Word of his survival spread, drawing attention from the media and sparking endless debates among neighbors and strangers alike. Some called it divine intervention, while others speculated about unknown scientific phenomena. But for the parents, none of that mattered. Their focus remained solely on their child, on the life that had been so unexpectedly returned to them. They spent every waking moment by his side, cherishing each smile, each coo, and each breath as if it were a gift. One evening, as the family sat together in the hospital room, the baby let out a soft laugh, a sound so pure and joyful that it brought tears to their eyes. The mother leaned over to kiss his forehead, her heart swelling with love. "You're our miracle," she whispered. "And we'll never stop being grateful for you." Outside, the city hummed with life, oblivious to the quiet miracle unfolding within the hospital walls. The moon hung high in the sky, its light spilling through the window and bathing the room in a soft glow. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the parents allowed themselves to believe that everything might just be okay.